Fairy tales are one of the most traditional ways of spreading awareness or educating others about a particular issue. Although this genre's audience has no age limit, it is utilized in children's education the most because it teaches them ethics and morals. These tales are often known to be satisfying and fun to read since they are often known to have a trope that ends with a smooth transition to happily ever after. I mean, who doesn't love a story with a happy ending? Though sometimes they can be problematic because they often perpetuates an unrealistic, harmful, and a false sense of what to expect from life.
So, what is trope? Well, it's known as a common theme to end the story of a tale, movie, books, etc. The happily ever ending technique is considered to be one of the most well known tropes till this day. It's been used around and recognized for decades. The first time happily ever after was used in Giovanni Boccaccio's translation of Decameron 1702. Over time, happily ever after would progress to have a different meaning like when it was first used. The ever after bit was a reference to heaven, but it now refers to together forever wedded in bliss. While happy endings can be positive, they can also be negative. As previously mentioned, it can be problematic for how unrealistic the storyline can be to get to the ending. Like other stories, there's more ways to deliver the message. To go into further detail, this trope is frequently used to simply satisfy audiences and give them what they want to see because a happy ending makes them feel good. Happily ever after gets problematic when it feels like a character got off extremely lucky by losing less than they ought to have. Happily ever afters are idealistic and hopeful for children, but it gives the reader the literal best case scenario ending, and likewise ignores the obvious fact that romance is not a spark but rather is a seed that needs to be planted, cultivated, and grown. In Fairy Tales and Happy Endings, NDF writes, though a lot of fairy tales preach happy endings and then one may come, it could be damaging because it can give us a false idea of reality, but it could also motivate and inspire a child to look beyond the limiting circumstances. It can be motivational to an impressionable audience, such as children, but it can also give a false sense of reality and how things can happen in real life. The biggest issue, due to how common it is in media we've consumed as children, are happily ever afters. It seems positive but can send a wrong message. Children's bedtime stories usually include appropriate settings and messages for them to dream about and have that sense of hope and faith. Fairy tales do a great job at scaring the kids and talking about the adventure of what the main character had to go through in order to be lucky in the end. According to Katie Batchelder, she said, where happily ever afters get problematic is when they mitigate the post-book costs, when it feels like a character got off extremely lucky by losing less than they ought to have. Tropes usually need to showcase the protagonist being the victim and show sympathy for them in order to garner in the audience/reader's attention. The issue here is that they showcase how unrealistic some people can get to their happy ending. It's engraving to the children's mind and creates this idea of how they can get anything that they please. In the eyes of adults, we assume that kids are incoherent and won't remember anything that was said to them when they're young, but it's not always the case because they might take the message taught to them in a different level when they're older. We'll talk about some great examples that we found about well-known fairy tales that I'm sure all of us know by now.
Cinderella, Snow White, Aladdin, and Rapunzel are one of the most popular tales of all time, which are known to have happy endings. While they may be a satisfying story to read, it's not a realistic portrayal of how life works. Life is much more complicated and difficult than that. For example, the original story of Cinderella is referred to as one of the happily ever after tales, since it concludes with Cinderella marrying the prince and living happily ever after. It portrays the idea that being beautiful can find you true love, and how happiness can only come from finding a prince or marrying into a wealthy family. As Perrault writes, he thought she was more charming than before, and a few days after married her. And the original moral of the story was, beauty in a woman is a rare treasure that will always be admired. The idea that happiness comes from marrying a prince or other wealthy person is not only unrealistic but also harmful. It can lead people to believe that they need to find a rich partner in order to be happy, which is not true. It also gives away the false sense that in order to find a Prince Charming or true love, you need to be beautiful and perfect.
In addition to Cinderella, the Grimm brothers' original story of Little Snow White is also seen as a happy ending, as it concludes with Snow White marrying the prince and living happily ever after. This also illustrates the belief that beauty can lead to finding true love. In the case of Snow White, there are numerous unrealistic and harmful aspects, particularly her emphasis on physical beauty as the most important attribute. The evil stepmother is consumed by jealousy over Snow White's beauty and orders her to be killed. Ultimately, Snow White is saved by a handsome prince who falls in love with her beauty at first sight, reinforcing the false notion that beauty leads to a happy ending.
To support this, the Grimms write, "He saw the coffin on the mountain with beautiful Snow White in it. I love you more than anything else in this world. Come with me to my father's castle. You shall become my wife." Snow White loved him, and she went with him.
This reinforces the idea that beauty is the ultimate prerequisite for finding true love, which can create unrealistic expectations and pressures to conform to a certain standard of physical appearance. This further emphasizes the fact that feeling envious of someone's physical attractiveness can have damaging consequences. It is important to remember that true love is not solely dependent on physical beauty, but rather on inner qualities such as personality, values, and character. Moreover, in Aladdin's story, he is a poor but kind-hearted young man who falls in love with Princess Jasmine, the daughter of the Sultan. With the help of a magical genie, Aladdin is able to win the princess's heart, and they become engaged to be married. However, an evil sorcerer named Jafar tries to steal the genie's lamp and take control of the kingdom. Aladdin ultimately defeats Jafar and saves the kingdom, and he is rewarded by being made the new sultan. He marries Jasmine, and they live happily ever after.
Honor and integrity will never again be questioned here in Aqraba. A more noble and sincere young man has never graced the chambers of this palace.
Well,
Wow. I would be honored to call you my son. If that were something anyone wanted.
Tale of Aladdin and the Lamp could create a false sense of what to expect from life. The story may lead readers to believe that material possessions and social status are the key to happiness and success. Aladdin is able to gain wealth and marry a princess through the use of the lamp, but this comes at a cost of his integrity and honesty. The central romance between Aladdin and Jasmine is based on a series of lies and deception. With Aladdin pretending to be a prince in order to win her affection, this sends a problematic message that it is acceptable to deceive someone in order to gain their love. Additionally, the ending shows Aladdin and Jasmine getting married and living happily ever after, despite the fact that they have only known each other for a short period of time. This promotes an unrealistic and harmful view of love and relationships that can be damaging to young viewers. In Rapunzel's story, she's known to be trapped inside of a tall building. She's basically tortured inside the house for having to use her long hair to bring up her mother and the prince. She is also not allowed to go outside either because the stepmother doesn't want her to find out the truth and have her run away. But when the prince finds her and is separated from her, they end up finding each other again and live happily ever after. This tale's moral portrays how one should never give up on true love, which is bothering from the examples stated in the story. They also portray how once again, if you don't have beauty, then you won't be able to sway a guy for them to be yours. The Grimm brothers wrote, "He heard a voice and thought it was familiar. He advanced toward it, and as he approached, Rapunzel recognized him and, crying, threw her arms around his neck. 2 of her tears fell into his eyes, and they became clear once again, and he could see as well as before. He led her into his kingdom, where he was received with joy, and for a long time they lived happily and satisfied." The tale of Rapunzel sets up a false aspect of how a young man can fall in love with a girl without knowing who she really is for her looks and singing as well. It's a common message that was used along with the other fairy tales, The fairy tale never mentions how old she is and about the details of them having sex. They imply it, and one can assume that they did it at some point because at the end of the story she's found by the prince with 2 children. Again, one can assume that it must be his kids.
Ultimately, while these fairy tales may be fun stories to read or watch, it's important to remember that it's just a story and not a realistic portrayal of life. To conclude, they often present an idealized view of the world and problematic messages, such as beauty standards, which can lead to harmful stereotypes and biases. For example, good always triumphs over evil and everyone lives happily ever after. While this may be a comforting message, it can also be harmful if the audience comes to believe that life should always be fair and they will always get what they want. And since the audience for this genre is mostly children's, they can be easily brainwashed by this. By acknowledging the problematic aspects of some fairy tales, we can help children develop critical thinking skills and learn to question the messages they receive from these tales. This can help them to develop a more nuanced understanding of the world and to recognize that life is often complex and unpredictable rather than simply black and white.